Carrie, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Well, thank you. I don't know when I did that. How long have I been muted? Oh
The
my,
entire time we were on early, so you were muted because y'all were having a conversation.
well, good to know. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to Commercial Contracts. We were discussing the financing contingency. That's how we're going over here today. So one thing I did bring out, just going to catch up to those who didn't have me on Voisa. Remember that the closing will occur wherever you write it here. So you can choose the county in which the closing will take place, unlike vacant land where it's assumed to close in the county where the property is located. Well, that's one difference between, so residential and vacant land and commercial, you kind of get a hybrid. They kind of pick and choose things from each one of them. So that's one of the things. Now, we're going into financing. And one thing you'll notice is it doesn't say check if there's financing or no financing, right? So if you don't fill this in, guess what? You're not making a contingent on financing. And if you don't fill it in completely, a lot of these things don't have if left blank. That's the other really big difference between vacant land and commercial, that you oftentimes in residential have the if left blank, right? So if you'll notice, for example, okay, it does say if you didn't apply honor before, it does say if left blank 5 days, but the buyer will apply for a third party financing the amount not to exceed either the percentage of the purchase price or the dollar amount. You don't have to put them both in. If we're looking for, 20%, so they want to put down an 80% loan, you could write that, or you could write the dollar amount, but you don't have to write both because that may change, right? But what you could make sure that you definitely want to do is it based on interest, variable interest rate or fixed interest rate? And also no points commitments. Remember, there's a lot of times people buy points in commercial because commercial loans tend to be much higher. So this is something that you've got to make sure you speak to the lender and you really understand the type of financing they're trying to get. Because if you don't follow it in here correctly, and normally it's not going to be a term of 30 years, right? This is commercial. I mean, maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 5 years, could be 7 years. They're probably not going to be all that long. But notice again, none of these say if left blank. And it tells you how long they're amortizing it, right? Because you might amortize it over 5 years with a balloon payment or something like that. So you're not going to know any of these terms. You have to go to the lender. It's critical that you talk to the lender in a commercial deal to find out what to fill in here. If you don't fill anything in, you're not giving your buyer a contingency. So that's really important. Obviously, it says that they're going to give all the information, employment, financial, everything timely. And they have to use good faith and reasonable diligence. So that's another thing. It's very similar to the residential contract in that sense. Don't try to get out with a finance contingency when they didn't give all their financials or they didn't actually ever file this happens often in commercial because a lot of these are business owners, right? So what do? They usually wrote off all of their profits, showing no profits, so don't have to pay any taxes. And now they have to amend their taxes, but they didn't amend it in time and they didn't give you the documents. And so therefore they can't get you the loan. That doesn't mean that you're going to get out, right, with the finance contingency, because if your part was to actually amend your taxes, they're assuming you're going to do that. So this is something that I see a lot in commercial. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen that, right? Okay, if after the buyer uses good faith and reasonable diligence, they fail to obtain the loan by the loan approval date, buyer may within, and if it says if left blank 3 days, give notice. So what this says is that you get a loan declination. Let's say you have loan approval through the 15th, you're declined on the 3rd, on the 10th. You have 3 days to notify them that you're going to cancel the contract due to this contingency. If you don't, then what happens is you are waiving that contingency and you're assumed to continue as cash. So be very careful. You can write in a longer date here, but see however many days you have to deliver written notice to the seller that the buyer either waives their financing contingency or cancels the contract. Don't forget, if you don't do that, doesn't mean just because you got declined, you're okay. You're not. This little thing right here is critically important in a commercial contract. So I would probably not even leave it blank. I might give yourself a little more time because the reality is in commercial, maybe one lender doesn't work, but maybe you could get another, right? So if you say, okay, well, maybe we'll try to get another one. And then you're waiting and trying to get another lender. And then you've got to pass that contingency period. But now you don't have the opportunity of letting them know that you got declined and you're applying for something different than you wrote here. Are you covered? No. So this is the thing, you've got to make sure that you're contracted it's big in commercial, write addendums. If you're changing, especially financing, like if you were trying to go SBA, then you're trying to change to some kind of hard money lender, or change your financing contingency. Because if you don't, it won't be contingent on that. And commercial, more than anything, is slimier than slimy, and they will keep that deposit every chance they get in commercial.
Realistic, like 15, like, I don't want them to feel that's too far out.
For having getting another loan, or for giving them the
Just to
chance.
protect
I
ourselves.
would say, I mean, you could put 5 or 10 days. I mean, you'll be okay with that, but you have to be on top of the timeline is the key. So good question. How long is, if you say 3 and you don't think about it, and then you're like, before you know it, oh my gosh, 3 days is nothing, right? So that's why I'm saying, give yourself a little extra time. I'd do 5 or 10, something like that. But again, always keep up on the lenders. Commercial lenders will tell you, yeah, sure. Nope, can't do it. And then you're sitting here going, oh my gosh, make sure you're within your financing contingency. If you're going to try to get another loan and it doesn't fit the kinds of terms you wrote down, do an addendum to change the financing contingency terms. Because commercial, again, does not follow all the same rules and guidelines that residential does. Okay, any questions on that? Now, it does say here, if the buyer does neither, then the seller may cancel the contract. So that's another thing. Just like in the residential contract, if you didn't give us written notice that you've gotten the loan, the seller may cancel the contract by delivering to the buyer anytime. So what does that mean? The loan approval period ends. You didn't notify the seller. You might have a loan, but the seller can now cancel that contract anytime they want to. Unlike in the residential contract where they have 3 days after to cancel and then they're kind of stuck, right? Here it doesn't say that, does it? It says anytime thereafter. That's kind of scary.
Yeah.
So this is why you've got to really understand when you're dealing with commercial, and commercial is a totally different beast, and lenders are all over the place and buyers are all over the place. It's usually not the same thing with the multiple offer bidding wars that we're having, but a lot of people are always trying to either get your commission, try to keep the deposit. I mean, there's a lot of sliminess in commercial. Okay. Unless the financial contingency has been waived, the contract remains subject to the satisfaction of the closing of the conditions, which is interesting because remember, with a commercial loan, there's a lot of different conditions than in a residential loan. It's not like just checking your employment again. They may be checking the financials. They may be there's a lot of things because they're making it contingent on the property that they're purchasing, right? And so it's not just a regular home that they're going to live in. They're saying they're making money from this property. They want to make sure that these things are happening. So you may have a lot of contingencies. And so that's an interesting thing that they call out here. Now, if the buyer sees good faith, reasonable diligence, but doesn't get the loan by the loan approval date, then thereafter, either party can cancel the contract. And if the lender fails or refuses to close on the closing date without fault on the buyer's part, the deposit shall be returned. So that's a good thing, but still make sure you're very, very up on your timelines in this. If neither party likes to terminate the contract as set forth, the buyer fails to use good faith and reasonable diligence as set forth. So that's just like we were talking about before. They were supposed to refile their taxes and they didn't do it. That's failure of diligent effort, isn't it? The seller will be entitled to retain the deposits. Don't think they're not going to be checking with the lender to see, there was conditions pending, and there's a lot of times things that they have to run back and forth, especially like SBA. If they're not doing the diligent effort and getting those documents and changing things in a timely fashion, they're going to keep that deposit because they're going to say you didn't get the loan because of diligent effort. All right. Any questions on that? Because that's really important. It's stronger for sure, I would say, than a residential contract. Okay. Title, the seller has to have legal capacity to convey marketable title. Again, this is just like in the land contract. What is a statutory warranty? Does anybody know? In residential terms, we call it general warranty deed. Woo! Same thing. Okay. Special warranty deed or other. Make sure it's not a quitclaim deed. It needs to be free of liens, easements, encumbrances. This is all the same as we saw on the vacant land and also on the residential. But here it says too, restrictions to public utility easements of record, existing zoning and governmental regulations, and any other matters. So sometimes in commercial, this could also be relevant to, for example, environmental issues that are being taken care of. What was that big company? Oh, Lockheed Martin. Didn't you? Someone told me Lockheed Martin's being sued for environmental issues.
Yeah.
You're the one who told me. I was like, somebody told me that. So Environmental issues tend to be one of the bigger problems, I would tell you, in commercial. I mean, yes, there's zoning issues and things of that nature too, but environmental recently is becoming even bigger. They're really cracking down on a lot of those things. So make sure that they're doing really good diligent effort, that you're not involved in that feasibility study. That's not up to you. That is not your, your place where you play, because that is a huge issue. You do not want to buy a commercial space and then have to clean up someone else's mess. That can be very costly. And it says here, the provided there exists at closing no violations of foregoing, and none of them prevent the buyer's intended use of the property as. This is really cool, because you can say what the buyer wants to use it for, and then they can't use it due to governmental restrictions or any of those things. Now they can get out of that because it's not free and marketable title that he can get. Make sense? Evidence of title. So who pays, again, is very similar. If this, but you can check. So if the who is going to select the closing agent and the title closing services, if it's the seller, who's going to pay for it, buyer or seller? And after how many days, or at least I prefer, instead of after how many days, blank days before closing, to deliver either title insurance commitment, right? Or they're going to do an abstract of title. This is just like on the vacant land, right? We talked about that. But what I like better is the blank days before closing date. Give yourself time, 20, 15, whatever, 25 days, because that's going to give you time to go ahead and make sure that, especially if it's commercial, they did, I would like it, if they do just a title insurance commitment, you want to maybe even get an abstract. You might even want to recommend that to see other usages for the same property, to see if it's anything that could have environmental impact. Right? These are things that I would recommend. Now, typically, your commercial deal is going to be probably represented by an attorney. But I say typically, because I've seen very recently a lot of people who think they're investors and they want to start playing in the space. And if you're not confident in this space and you're working with somebody who doesn't know what the heck they're doing, those would be the first people who want to sue you when something goes wrong. So every time, I would always highly recommend make sure they have an attorney who is doing it. I also personally feel, and this is my opinion, but it's true, whoever holds the money holds the power, right? Would we all agree with that?
Yes.
So I would definitely say in a commercial deal, it's worth the buyer paying the title fees, who cares, to be able to hold the money. Does that make sense to you guys? I mean, I would definitely do that. Maybe not necessarily important in a residential, maybe, but definitely, in my opinion, very important in a commercial deal. Okay, so here we go. Let's keep going. Title examination. The buyer has 15 days from the receipt of evidence of title to deliver to the seller any title defects. This is something that's really important, because you only have 15 days when you have the receipt of the evidence. So you have to make sure that they are really looking to see, do they own it? Are there encumbrances? Encumbrances are big in commercial. A lot of times the guy next door took over some of their land and now they're using, there's all sorts of things that happen. Maybe utilities have come through the years and now they're putting easements and they're still using it. They're putting their trucks on it and they're burying things or whatever, but they really shouldn't be, right? So these are things you got to look into. Just because people have been using it that way and they haven't been caught doesn't mean that you can continue to use it that way, right? Because it really is against the new rules and regulations that have been imposed upon that land. That's the one thing about commercial. It's not like a house. People are using the house, and how often, maybe you add a pool, maybe you add a fence. But other than that, right, most of that stuff's not going to change. But in commercial, it changes all the time. Okay, so any questions on that? Now, remember, the seller uses good faith and diligent effort to cure defects. Notice again, the seller. So the buyer gives written notice and the seller is the one who has to cure the defects. That's important. And the seller may elect not to cure them. So if it comes out that it's too expensive, they're going to say, listen, we're not going to do it. And they can tell the buyer, listen, either this is the cost, you can do it on your own, or you can accept it. The buyer has 10 days to decide if they're going to do that or terminate the contract. If they terminate the contract, they get their money back. If they decide to continue, they're going to continue with the title defects, right? So make sure that this is a real conversation that everybody understands. That's really scary. I'm like, woo, that was me in double. Any questions on that? Because that's really a big one. Curing title defects in a commercial property. Remember, that's what attorneys use the quick claim deeds for. It's a process and it could take extra time. What you don't want to do is think that it's in process because you're not kind of involved. And then before you know it, the 10 days have passed and he's accepted it. right? So this is where I'm talking about. Can we negotiate always, right? Can we say, hey, wait a minute, these title defects are bigger. We want to change the price, or we're going to cancel. Yes, you can do all of those things, but you only have 10 days from the receipt to do it. It's nothing, because by the time you talk to the attorneys, by the time you figure out what it would take, by the time, you've lost probably 5 days right there. So make sure when you are doing, especially a commercial deal, you're plugging all that into your calendar. You're doing it ahead of time to make sure you're proactive about it, because the last thing you want to do is say, oh, I'm sorry, now you're stuck. Now, can he cancel? Yes. Will he lose his deposit? Yes. Right. And in a commercial deal, that could be a bigger deal because they usually put down a lot more deposits. Now, again, this is why I like to put staged deposits like we talked about, because it's less money to lose, right? Until you pass a couple of things. But just be very conscious. Title defects are a real thing a lot in commercial, and you'll have 10 days to decide, right? You can even extend it. You could put in an addendum to extend that time period, right? But just do something before the 10-day ends. All right. So the survey, seller will within blank days from the effective date. If you do not fill that in, the seller really doesn't have to, right? Because there's nothing that says if left blank. I mean, blank days from effective date, could that be 180? Sure. Could it be after the closing? Absolutely, because it doesn't say it's not. This is where I'm saying it's super really important to make sure you fill in all the blanks in this commercial contract. So within however many days from the effective date, to deliver the buyer copies of the prior surveys, plans, specifications, engineering documents, and any of the following related to the transaction. So maybe there's some zoning stuff, maybe they have plans for future land use change, whatever they have or had prepared for them. Maybe they had entitlements done on the land, right? Things like that. Any of those things I would write that in. If there were entitlements that you're doing, or maybe you're in the process of planning for the PUD and you have all sorts of planning in with zoning. I mean, all of those things, write them down, because you want to make sure you get them all. And I would make this as short as possible. 3 days from the effective date, 2 days from the effective date, because again, they're accepting it. It's kind of like when you have a residential house and it's subject to a lease, right? They're accepting the property subject to that lease. That lease will have the leasing has more rights than the seller does when they become the buyer, right? Because now they own the property, but they can't use it because the leasing does. Well, it's kind of similar here, right? You buy this property and it's subject to the terms and conditions that the property has the ability to use it as. So, great, you took the property, you thought that it was going to be able to change the land use to make it available so that they could add the bathroom and the kitchen and whatever they wanted to do in their development or their commercial space. Maybe they want to add a little eatery area, but they can't now. And what do? They're stuck with it. And then it goes to the city, like, with Windermere High School, right? It becomes a big problem just because zoning doesn't have to change their mind. So, okay. Or the buyer will, at buyer's or seller's expense, within the time period allowed, examine the title evidence, obtain a current certified survey of the property from a registered surveyor, important. If the survey reveals encroachments on the property, or that the improvements encroach on other people's property, the buyer will accept the property with encroachments, or such encroachments will constitute a title defect. Really important. I would always say, check such encroachments will constitute a title defect. Now, so the thing is here, you're going to make sure you're taking all this stuff, obviously, from what they have from the seller, but the buyer is going to either pay for or have the seller pay for a new survey. To something they're going to be able to deliver and examine the evidence of the title, right? They're going to see the survey. They're going to see if there's encroachment. So if they've added a second bay for their, warehouse, and it goes on the neighbor's land, that's an encroachment, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that you could buy that thinking it's yours, and then the neighbor could be like, get that building off of there. You're on my land. See, this is the thing. Right. So that's why I would say such encroachments constitute a title defect. That way, now the current seller has to deal with that issue, either get the other side to waive it, to sell it off to them, however they can handle that, and get the encroachment, rewrite that, that survey, get a new survey now that property has been annexed in, you know what I'm saying? Or they have the chance to get out. They may say, no, we don't want to. We'll take the chance. The seller, the people who own the other side, they're out of town buyers. They never even use it. They're never in town. But they should know what they're getting into, right? They should know what potential possibilities could happen. And really, if you even bought a residential home and your pool that was built encroached on your neighbor's property, you buy that home, guess what happens? The neighbor could come back and say, your pool is on my property, you have to move it. You have to actually remove the pool or try to get the pay the neighbor or something like that, which is a bigger deal. I've seen people have to actually remove. And usually it's more fences and things. Could you imagine having to remove a pool? That's insane. So these are things that are really big though, especially in commercial, because a lot of times this land's been owned for a long time. The usage of it has changed. They build onto it all the time. And so that's where these encroachments become a big deal.
I'll say somebody had to remove the she shed and converted that they got their mother-in-law lived in. She was awesome because he got to evict his mother-in-law.
Well, as long as he enjoyed evicting his mother.
Yeah, the wife did not like that.
But in a contract, like, if on the corner of a property, they have a water pipe.
So the question is, would an encroachment be like a water pipe?
If it was on your property, but then it damaged your neighbors.
So the problem is that those canal waterways are not put in by the neighbor, they're not put in by you. That's put in by the infrastructure of the county. So I would say 99% of the time, that's gonna have an easement over it anyway.
Mhm.
So you won't be able to use that property. So if it damages it or not, it wasn't your property to use, because you have, like a gross easement is for cable, which always cracks me up. It's gross. It is gross. It's an ugly box. But with the canal, that is also, I'm sure some type of easement that's given by either the county or the city of or whoever owns that. So in that instance, no, that wouldn't be an encroachment. It's really more if, actually, we had a situation, my in-laws own land in Naples, and the neighbor, they've never built on their land, but the neighbor built in a shed, and he put the shed onto their land. Yeah, so we always make sure we're constantly checking that, because remember, 7 years go by, that's now his land, right? So we don't want to do that. So we made him move his shed over. Absolutely. Yes, we did. We have great relationships with them. Good thing we're not down in Naples. Okay, any other questions about that? Because these are all good questions. Okay, property condition. The seller will deliver the property to the buyer at the agreed time in its present as is condition with any ordinary wear and tear. But that means they have to maintain the landscaping, the grounds in comparable condition. So that happens a lot, when they put it on the market, they have fresh sod, they have all this beautiful, mulch or whatever. And let's say it's a storefront. And then maybe the sprinkler head breaks, one or two, and they don't get it fixed. And then it turns brown. And now you're closing on it and you don't have pretty grass. And they have to maintain that in as is condition. So could you say, you need to remulch, you need to fix the grass, you need to fix the sprinkler head? Absolutely. You definitely can. That is important. And that's not regular wear and tear, by the way. Okay. If the sprinkler heads break and the grass dies, that's not normal wear and tear. Okay, seller makes no warranties other than marketable titles. So in the event the condition of the property has materially changed since the expiration of the due diligence period, the buyer may elect to terminate the contract and receive a refund of the deposits paid plus interest, if applicable, or require the seller to return the property to the existing condition at the end of the due diligence period. Isn't that interesting? And it says with the cost not to exceed. This is if left blank, 1.5% of the purchase price. That's expensive. But this is really important because, they could have changed the property while you're under contract. And then you're like, what the heck happened? This isn't what I agreed to. So this is the beautiful thing. They have to either keep it the way it was or pay up to whatever amount you agree upon to change it back. Because the point is you bought it, right? Thinking you were going to use it in a specific way if they've changed the usage, which, for example, tree farms, right? If tree farms, they sold all their trees. Did you get it in the way you had intended? No, now you have no trees. You probably lost your exemption. So these are things you got to think about.
Question.
Yes.
Is that something that can be made, can come out of closed proceeds, or that's something that needs to be done before it closes?
That's money due at closing.
Maybe that close that one
Or they
house.
have to fix it before closing. So it depends, really, it's negotiable.
Okay.
It's assumed it will be at closing conveyed in the way you intended to. But it's just like if you are negotiating for repairs on a house, you could say, listen, we'll give you a credit in lieu of repairs. I mean, that happens all the time.
Okay.
Yeah, all this stuff, more so in commercial than ever, is negotiable. You know what I mean? Commercial is extremely negotiable.
That sounded like that example you gave, sounded like a nightmare. When somebody bought it and had that exemption with the trees and somebody removed the trees.
That's a pretty, I've never actually
How
seen
you
that
put
happen.
the trees back? Like, that's a
But you know,
nightmare.
it could happen, right? There goes your business. What if you bought the tree farm? And they said, well,
You would've
we
made
just
money or
used the trees
something.
that were there, but you can plant more. Well, that's not cool. That's not what I bought. I bought the crop. Did you buy the crop? Did you have it in writing? Like, this is where, if you're buying a tree farm that comes with actual trees, I would go with actually having an attorney write that up, because that's one of those things. That's property that's being conveyed at the at the sale.
I know that was an
Mhm.
example. I just thought about these guys that were selling some vacant land in New Smyrna. And they were using the orange blossoms to make the particular kind of honey that they sold at the farmer's market. Oh my God.
This stuff happens, guys. It's true. It's just something you got to think about. But especially with exemptions too, you have to make sure that those exemptions convey, right? Because if it's a tree farm or for some kind of farm exemption, an ag exemption, ag's usually it's like already residential ag, but if it's commercial and they have an exemption, like a church exemption or something like that, you have to see to make sure that all these things will convey. I think I gave the example of we had an exemption for a home we were selling in downtown Mount Dora. And it had an exemption to be a bed and breakfast. It really wasn't zoned that way, but it had an exemption. But that exemption did not convey at sale. So we had to go back to the county to see if we could get that exemption transferable to the new owner. Because if not, what were they buying? They wanted to buy it as a bed and breakfast, right? So it's interesting. Sometimes these things, it depends on how long ago they got it and
So who
what's
was
changed now?
contacted the county for that?
That was the city of Mount Dora.
City of Mount Dora?
Yeah, you had to go to zoning.
Zoning.
Mhm.
Okay.
Most of the time, anything to do with land use is going to be zoning.
Okay.
Okay, so any questions against that? Okay, so now it says, by accepting the property as is, buyer waives all claims against the seller for any defects in the property. So you're either going to say you're accepting it as is and you're waiving your right to inspect the property. Don't do that. Even if the guys tell you that the investors, men, women, whoever they are, they say, yeah, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to buy it. Still say due diligence period. I mean, unless you think it's just going to kick you out of the sale, because what if they want to do it? Now they can't. And they could have any test done, but it's no longer contingent on that, right? And that's a big deal in commercial and vacant land. And I see a lot of times, for example, somebody buying vacant land and they say, oh, I don't really care. I'm not going to use it. We're just going to keep it in the family. And right, we're just going to waive that. I would always say, don't waive it. Keep it in there. You may decide you want to check to make sure it's buildable. You want to check to make sure that, what you can do with the land or if it needs mitigation or exactly. So, and sometimes people are like, no, we're fine. Make them sign a whole harmless because you want to make sure that they know you did everything you could to inform them that they should have an inspection period. It's just like the hold harmless in the residential, but I think it's worse in commercial and vacant land. Okay, so the due diligence period is very similar to the vacant land. It's going to be at the buyer's expense. They have blank days from the effective date. So guys, this is not if left blank 30 days. Vacant contract says if left blank 30 days. This does not. If you do not fill it in, how long do you have? 0. So you could check the little box, but forget to write something in here, and now you don't have it anyway. Bless you. So it's really important that you fill every little box in here. Okay, in buyer's sole and absolute discretion, this is the most important part. We're getting to determine if this property is suitable. That is why you would be crazy if you're representing the buyer to let them waive that right? They should have the opportunity to say, what do you mean? I can't put my bedroom facing the lake, right? What do you mean? It doesn't work like that. What do you mean? I'm not going to be able to add that second bathroom for the guests and a little kitchen, right? Or whatever the case is. So you have to make sure that you are checking this. All right. So during the contract, the buyer may conduct any test analysis, surveys, investigations that they deem necessary to satisfy the property's engineering, architectural, environmental properties, zoning restrictions, flood zone designation, restrictions, subdivision regulations. Listen, a big one about subdivision is density, right? Density is huge. I think I shared the other day, but I'll mention it briefly again. We had a guy who was selling, it was exempt as a church, but he wanted to sell the land again in a PUD that was long approved. He had several acres. I don't remember, maybe 10 or something. You could have put a lot of houses, except the density was all used up. So he couldn't build more than, I think, 2 properties there. on 10 acres. The land is not usable anymore, right? And is the county going to give more density there? Probably not. You could go to the county and ask, but good luck, because density is a tough thing, because density affects roads, right? Affects utilities. So they're not so apt to say, sure, you can put more homes in there. No, because now they're going to have to redo maybe the infrastructure, which could cost the county or whoever city up a lot of money. That's why density is set the way it's set.
But oftentimes, don't they want to do that so that they can get more tax dollars, which would allow them to make the improvements to the infrastructure?
It really depends on the infrastructure and the cost to change it, right? So great question. Yeah, they love the impact fees. They love the cost to change things. But if the cost to redo for example, if it has to do with irrigation, sewage water, that's expensive. You got to tear all those roads up, right? Oof, that's a bad one. If it may be widening the road, that might not be that big of a deal. But, because they have to do traffic studies then. So that's another thing. They don't just determine, sure, we'll make it more dense. They're going to run traffic studies. There's a whole thing that they have to do to see the viability of changing that property. And when we went to the county, you know what they said? No. He said, don't you want it? No.
And if they were actually considering it, would they also have to let the people in the neighborhood surrounding it get their approval as well?
Great question, April. So oftentimes, if you're changing density, yes, that would require a public hearing. Again, that's going to be determined by the county or the city of that the property is within. But yeah, commercial, for example, you have a land use that comes with it, right? So maybe it's light industrial. Well, these are all the different things you could use it for. And it may even be in the land use plan, but they still may require public hearings. So that's a weird thing about public hearings. It's determined by the city or the county what actual things will constitute a public hearing. And sometimes they're the weirdest things. So always ask those questions. Absolutely. Would this require a public hearing? Because if it does, yeah. Now we're looking at a long time period, right? Okay. Everybody good on that? Okay, so notice, so just like here, availability to access to public roads, right? A consistency with local, state, and regional growth management plans. That's a big one, because the growth management plans keep changing. Like St. Cloud, I think about 4 years ago, changed their whole growth management plan. They rewidened the roads and they changed things. Well, if you wanted to build something that you had the land use for, but now that they have this new comprehensive land that they want to put a road right through your property, they're not gonna. That's happening to a community in Narcoossee. They want to put a road through a community.
Well, I
I forwarded that too.
almost
Yeah. That's true. And nobody likes it, even when they're done. Yeah. So these are big things. Exactly. So, and a lot of times we have no idea what the growth management plans were. So, mhm.
How do you, how far in advance that's just like town hall meetings or public hearings?
Okay. I love that question. How do you first started with it? How do you don't?
Okay.
Right. This is exactly where you say to the buyer, I recommend there are attorneys that handle all of the due diligence.
Got it.
There are attorneys that focus completely on zoning, and they're the ones that would be, representing the customer and going to those town hall meetings, public hearings, or whatever that case is. You want to make sure you pass that off. You don't want to be responsible. You can hand off an engineer who can do the soil test, who can do the density. You can hand that off, but you don't want to be part of it. Always recommend that they use third parties. And I suggest if you want to get in commercial, have some good people to recommend. Definitely. I have some good soil people I can recommend. I could tell you in Miami, some really great attorneys for zoning. I don't really know some good zoning attorneys here, but I'm sure we could find you guys some. So, but that's really important. Here you go. This is a big one too. Ability of permits, government approvals, licenses, compliance with American Disabilities Act. ADA is huge, and they keep changing those rules and requirements. So if you had a structure, especially for commercial, that was built how many years ago, they may require an overhaul. You may have to redo the bathrooms. You may have to add ramps in. I mean, there's a lot of things that could come up from that. So the worst thing is that your guy's like, oh, it's perfect just the way it is. He doesn't check any of this. He closes on it, and then ADA comes knocking on his door and says, okay, so here's all the things you got to change. They're not gonna be happy with you, right? So these are things. Absence of asbestos. Okay, asbestos is a big deal. You've had that situation. So yeah, asbestos, they say as long as you don't touch it is okay.
Correct. Yeah.
As soon as it's touched,
Yeah,
It's a
exactly.
huge issue, and it requires licensed individuals who know how to handle asbestos, and it can get very costly.
They shut them off.
That was the first job I
Yeah.
got out of the.
No, you
Army.
can't enter it. And you shouldn't enter it, because once that stuff gets in the air,
Yeah, that was the first job I got out of the Army.
oh,
The game, remember they get up there with the Jaguars play, we used to call it just a game ball?
uh,
Like, the first license I got was from Ocean. Lead and asbestos, I had to take like a week
Ah.
class. Let me tell you something, 100% humidity and 95-degree heat, wearing a tie-back suit, it's crazy. It gets in the air, it's over.
Uh-huh.
Yes,
Yeah.
That's no joke.
and it's, lung cancer is a big thing from
Mesothelioma,
it.
all of
Oh
that.
yeah, so many different types of awful, awful cancers and terrible things. So yeah, you don't want to play around with asbestos. Soil and groundwater contamination is another really big one. And again, we've talked about that before, depending on what type of business work there. Just because the EPA has not come after it yet, doesn't mean they're not going to do so, right?
Have it in Tampa, with that radioactive water.
Oh my
That's
gosh, yes, the radioactive water that was dumped into the bay recently, that was horrible.
500 million, they down to 300 million, they gotta empty it out, and so now.
And all the people who currently own those businesses are the ones paying for it.
Yep.
And guess what? They probably, none of them had anything to do with it.
Nope.
Yeah,
It's gonna
so
be a nightmare.
it is gonna be a nightmare. That's a great point.
Oh.
So these are all the reasons why you require them to have an attorney to review all this stuff. There's a lot of things that could go wrong with this. Okay, now notice the buyer gets to determine that this is good in their sole discretion, but they have to give written notice to the seller of before the end of the due diligence period, whether or not they're going to say it's acceptable. Because if they fail to give written notice, and this is so big, guess what? They're accepting it as is. So if you wrote up here 30 days from the effective date and you're still running tests and you didn't get an extension, you better make a call. Are you going to back out or are you going to accept it? Because if they won't extend it, you better make a call. Because if you say, oh, no problem, we'll wait a couple of days. If they didn't give you an extension, they can wait as many days as they want. But they're assuming you're going to accept it as is and you'll lose your deposit. Which is another reason I like to put extra money down in a commercial deal after due diligence. Okay, any questions on that? Obviously, anything that you did work and so you have to repair it, bring it back to the way it was at the buyer's expense. That's what they're talking about there. And also all of the buyer will at buyer's expense release to the seller all reports and other work generated as a result of the inspections. This is something that's different in here. For example, in a residential, when they have an inspection, do they have to release it to the seller? It's a trick question, isn't it? Because an as is, no. If they did a FAR bar, regular residential contract, and the seller puts in writing that they want to receive the report, they don't have to receive the whole report, but they must receive the summary report. This is saying the buyer will, at their expense, release all the reports to the seller. So if they deliver timely notice that it's not acceptable, obviously the seller releases the deposit and the contract's terminated. Walkthrough inspection, buyer may, on the day prior to closing or any other mutual time agreed, do a final walkthrough of the property. Interesting that they actually have a clause on that. Okay, so operation of property during contract period. See, that's something you normally think about with the home, right? Seller will continue to operate the property and conduct business on the property in the manner operated prior to the contract and will take no action that would adversely impact the property after closing. As to the tenants, lenders, or businesses, if any charges such rent, vacant space that materially affect the property or buyer's intended use of the property will be permitted only with the buyer's consent or without the buyer's consent. You have to select one. If you don't, you just waived your buyer's rights. So for example, if it's like that building we sold in Sanford, where the bottom was a grocery store, but up top had all these tenants, right? They continued to lease and all those things. But we said it was only with the buyer's consent, because if not, what if we changed that whole tenant downstairs? We went from that supermarket that had been there for, 30 years or whatever, and we changed it and put in some like terrible little supermarket because they gave us money to go in that space, right? Yeah, that could totally happen. Right. So that's why you want to make sure if you're representing the buyer, it's only with their consent. Okay, closing procedure. unless otherwise agree. And think about it. If you have still a grocery store, did you change the terms of what you were buying? You did, right? Because where did the goodwill go? So, but that's like a whole different thing you got to look into. All right, closing procedure. Unless otherwise agreed upon, closing shall be in accordance of the norms where the property is located. So remember, we said it could be somewhere else. If not, it's going to be in the property where it's located, in the county where it's located. Seller will deliver possession and occupancy of the property to the buyer at closing. They'll provide keys, remote control, security access, all of the things that they need to have. So obviously, with the business, you want to make sure they're getting all those things. For example, if they're also purchasing leases of equipment, sometimes that's being conveyed. That's why there's a lot more things that go in a business that's actually functioning. The cost of buyer pays attorney fees, taxes, recording fees, mortgage financing statements, obviously, recording fees of the deed. The seller will pay attorney's fees, taxes of the deed to record it. So basically pretty similar. They're also going to pay anything needed to cure the title defects. If the seller is obligated to discharge any encumbrances part of the closing, the buyer may use the purchase proceeds to satisfy the encumbrances. To answer your question, it says it right there. So the seller will provide a deed, a bill of sale, mechanic's lien affidavit, originals of anything assignable like service and maintenance contracts, and that's all going to be assumed by the buyer at closing date. And they will also have letters to each of the service contractors from the seller advising them of the sale of the property and, of course, who's the new buyer, right? So if the applicable assignees of the lease, updated rent rolls, tenants, lender estoppel letters of applicable, tenant subordination, non-disturbance and attorney agreements required by the buyer's lender, the assignments, permits, and licenses, corrective instruments, and letters notifying the tenants of the change of ownership. So all these things have to happen. There's a lot more things that have to happen at closing. Because let's say you're taking over a rent roll, you've got tenants in there, and the tenants don't accept that. They have to accept where their money's being going to. They have to accept who the new landlord is going to be. So that's why they have to be given notice, and it's a certain time frame of notice. Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. Isn't that crazy? Yeah. So they have to make sure, because you don't want to close on something. For example, when we were doing the acquisition for Regal, we were still waiting for the landlords to agree to give us the usage rights for Claremont and the one in Lake Mary. They had to assign the lease to us. And even though everybody said, sure, no problem, it's not a no problem until you have that in writing, right? So those are the things that there's a lot of external things that are happening, oftentimes with third parties, that you have to make sure are all done prior to closing. Because you definitely don't want to close on something and then later the landlord says, yeah, we don't agree. We did a little research on you. You were on this little video where you're wearing your hair up and you're yeah, you were the divorce doctor. We didn't like that. So yeah, no, exactly. So these are some things you got to think about. Make sure all of this is done prior to closing. Again, are you responsible? No, you don't want to make yourself responsible. That's why you make them get an attorney. Get an attorney. Do not take responsibility for this, guys. Yes. Well, that's the problem. And that's why it was a trick question. You totally fell for it, Stace.
I use an attorney almost every day.
Yeah.
Other businesses.
Yeah. But the thing is, in real estate, we are so used to taking so much of the control, right? We're so used to being responsible for things that should we even really be responsible for? I mean, let's be honest. But you cannot do that in commercial, which is why I'm going to say one more time, don't dabble in commercial. If you choose, you think you want to get interested in it, it sounds great. Work with somebody. Make sure at least your first couple transactions, you've got a mentor who's doing it with you, because there's so much more involved in this. And always, always, always get an attorney, which you don't pay for. So make sure they understand it's their obligation. Okay, real estate taxes, personal property taxes, and tangible taxes. This is for interest on rent, right? Collected association dues, CAM, could be CAM on a building, right? All these kinds of things. They're going to be prorated through the day before closing, just like vacant land. Interesting. If they don't know what the taxes are for the certain year, they're going to use last year's taxes, and they're going to keep an allowance for improvements or exemptions. Because sometimes you may not know, right? It may be too early on to see. The new tax bill hasn't been given out. They really don't know. So they're going to guess, but they'll hold a little back. Okay, a tax proration based on an estimate will, at the request of either party, be released upon the receipt of current year's tax bills. So that makes sense. I mean, you can't wait to close right until you get the taxes. So sometimes you got to go and hope for the best. But typically, if you look and see what they've been doing year over year, it's pretty accurate. But at least they hold money back, and that's something too you can always negotiate. Remember, all of these things are negotiable. You just got to think about them. Special assessment liens. So certified, confirmed, ratified special assessment liens as of the closing date will be paid by the seller. So they're widening that road because new density's been given to the property over there, and they're going to charge all of the owners, which is why they had to have the public hearing. But they're going to try to tell the public, listen, it's going to bring lots of tax revenue, so it's going to be worth it. So you're going to want to help pay for this. That happens, right? So this has to, all those special assessments would be paid for by the seller before closing. If there's something that is an ongoing, obviously that's something the buyer will assume the installments and they become payable after closing. So this is important, especially in a commercial. A lot of times you'll see a lot more assessments by the government and the counties and the cities up. And water, remember, in New York City, it's such a big deal when this huge new water bill went through. All of the car washes and the laundromats, which were huge business, especially the laundromats in New York City, got hit with this huge assessment. It was a water assessment, and the business might have gone from profitable to not because this water assessment. And then they even put in times of usage. So for the laundromats, there were certain times they couldn't use a certain amount of water. Oh my gosh, it was huge. So there are things like that that can happen that, maybe unbeknownst to the seller. But that's where too, I would definitely recommend that they have an attorney, and if it's their industry, they're looking to buy it. But water can happen here too. Water restrictions. Where was it? Where they made you water your lawn on certain days.
They still have that.
Yeah.
Is it everywhere though?
It's still Orange County, isn't it?
I don't know.
Lake County. Well, they'll have to see.
Lake County. I haven't heard them
think
talking.
We're only supposed to go like 2 days a week still. Yeah.
Well, imagine car washes, because we see a lot of these opening up. How does that affect, right? So these are things that you've got to make sure that they're aware of, we can bring to their attention. But again, are we responsible? No, don't be responsible. Get an attorney. FERPTA is a big deal in terms of, it's not like a residential property where they can waive the FERPTA, right? I mean, there's not going to be any waiving of the withholding, but definitely FERPTA is, oftentimes you'll see it involved in a sale because you have a lot of foreigners that also own business. So depending on how they own the business, was it an LLC? Who was the primary? There's a lot of rules and regulations. Just because they're foreign doesn't mean they comply with FERPTA. They may not have to do FERPTA because of the way that they were held in a corporation. So just make sure you get with a FERPTA specialist because you're not one of those either. All right, so obviously they both authorize the escrow and the closing agent to receive all deposits and hold everything. So then it also says if the agent has doubt to the agent's duty or obligations on this contract, they can actually talk about, so they have to mutually agree on this escrow agent. It can't be just, I pick the escrow agent, you don't pick them. We all have to feel good, whoever the escrow agent is. We have to make sure that they're holding the escrow and told us all of our rights. They deposit the escrow items with the clerk of the court, having jurisdiction over the matter to file an interpleader. So all of these things are in case there's a dispute. They have to make sure that they follow all of these rules and regulations by Chapter 475 Florida statutes. Any questions? If the agent is a licensed real estate broker, the agent will comply with 475 and any lawsuits that the agent interpleads with the escrow items. Okay, we don't hold escrow, so this is really not going to be a thing, but that is a huge ordeal because the escrow disbursement order would only be pertinent to a residential contract. It's not going to be pertinent to a commercial contract. So not a problem. Premier Sotheby's, we don't have deposits anyway, but if it's another company like Watson oftentimes holds deposits and they do have a commercial division. So just know they have to follow Florida statutes, but it's not the typical escrow disbursement order like we have in residential. Okay, cure period. Listen, it does say the non-compliant party will have, if left blank, 5 days, but still, I would definitely make sure you're filling something in there, right? Force majeure, this is the same as in a regular contract. If they cannot do maybe bind insurance, maybe run some inspections, anything because things have been disrupted because there's a hurricane coming or there's flooding, God forbid, or any kind of a earthquake or fire. Then force majeure kicks in and they have an extension time up to 7 days.
Right, that's just acting gospel.
Yeah, exactly. That's why COVID does not constitute, because although it could be an act of God, it didn't affect any closing services.
Right.
Right? You're still binding insurance. You're still, you know what I mean? If you think about it, you're still being able to run all your inspections. It doesn't affect electricity. None of those things are affected. So people, when COVID first started, were trying to use COVID as force majeure. A lot of the realtor sites were like, oh, you're covered under force majeure. No, you're not. It has nothing to do with the closing services required to be able to close the transaction. That's-
Active Satan, no.
Well, could be. Does it affect your insurance, your electricity? Like, okay, that's really, it really depends on, is it prohibiting the sale?
Gotcha.
That's really what it's about. And why is it prohibiting the sale? Because someone doesn't feel comfortable? I'm sorry, that's not prohibiting the sale, right? Okay, return of deposit. Obviously know that the buyer has timely given any of the required notice, then the buyer's deposit is returned. So like all those things we said, the due diligence period, the financing, as long as they put in writing within that time frame, they'll get their money back. If the buyer fails to put in writing, they are waiving that and they will not get their money back. And this is a big thing in commercial because they're really going to stick to that. All right, default. In the event the sale is not closed due to default or failure on the part of the seller, other than making the title marketable, the buyer may elect to receive the return of the buyer's deposit and thereby waive action for damages resulting from the seller's breach, and may seek to recover such damages or seek specific performance. If the buyer elects a deposit refund, the seller may be liable to the broker for the full amount of the brokerage fee. This is not something you see in a residential contract. So what does it say? They can go after liquidated damages. They can seek specific performance. That is something, what is specific performance? Does anybody know?
Somebody not doing the job.
Specific performance in this type of thing would mean you have to close. You said you were going to close. Now you're going to close. And we have seen, I've been involved in 2 different specific performance suits with our customers, and we've won them both. Which was great, but they're scary and they're messy and they're, so you better make sure if your customer's going to go after specific performance that you have followed by everything in that timeline. Because if they have stepped out off that line for 1 second and gone into the gray, they can deem that they're in default. That's what their attorneys are going to look for to see that they were in default, right? Also, interesting, the seller may be liable to pay the broker the full amount of the brokerage fee. So it could not close, but not to the fault of your buyer, and they still owe us a commission.
Yeah, it's like the headache. Do all of that.
Yeah, and you can put a lien on the commission, all these things, but it is a headache. It's time. You may never see it. It's true. Okay, in the event the sale doesn't close because the buyer defaulted, the seller may retain all deposits as agreed upon liquidated damages, consideration of the execution of the contract, and full settlement of the claims, or they can seek specific performance. They can say you have to buy. If the buyer fails to timely place a deposit as required by this contract, seller may elect to terminate the contract and seek the remedy outlined in paragraph 2, proceed with the contract without waiving the remedies for default. So what does this mean? This is one of those things. Let's see paragraph 2 really quickly. Let's go back up to paragraph 2. All right. All deposits will be credited to the purchase price and balance to close, such as for the purposes of this paragraph. Completion means by the end of the due diligence period or upon the delivery of the buyer's written notice of acceptability. So whatever you have written here, like let's say they put down an initial 20,000 and they were supposed to put an initial 50,000 after the diligence period, and they didn't do that, and they didn't give us written notice. What is this saying? It's saying that they could go after the entire 70,000. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions on that? Where are we? Default. So they call out specific performance a lot, which means we can make you close. They call out liquidated damages. So they can either say, we'll accept these deposits, kind of like in lieu of liquidated damages, or they can actually go for liquidated damages, go for specific performance. And, it's definitely if, we have a lot of times seen where somebody goes into contract, but they never put the deposit down, and so we just cancel it. If that happens in commercial, they can sue you. They can sue you for the deposit you didn't put down. Yeah, because you made an agreement that you were going to put it down. So therefore, they can go after you because you were liable for that deposit. And you're in default, right? Because you didn't do it. I have seen that in commercial. I have not seen that in residential, obviously, but definitely in commercial. So if you have a customer who's like, well, it's okay, I just want to put the deposit down until I'm sure. Don't do that. They may go after them for that deposit. And then they didn't get the property and they lost the deposit. Yeah, this is usually on big deals, but I have definitely, there was a case that I heard about. It was awful. It was like $150,000 and they didn't put it down in time and they sued them and won and they got the $150,000 and they got to resell the property. Yeah. Yeah. They let them go because they went for specific performance as well as the deposit because the buyer was in default. The buyer didn't want to close. So as a settlement, they just gave them the $150,000 that they were supposed to put down. Yeah. So this stuff happens in commercial. That's why you got to be really aware of it. Oh my gosh, it's 11 o'clock. I haven't even got through this one. We never even got to the commercial listing. All right. So let's look at this really quickly. All notices must be in writing, be delivered by mail, courier, personal delivery, or electronic means. So text messaging, email, they all count. Disclosures, this is really important. I'm going to go do this and we'll leave this on this note. Remember, we just talked about the fact that if it doesn't close because of the fault of the seller, the buyer's broker can go after a commission, right? So can the seller's broker, by the way. They can go for total commission. And actually, the Florida Commercial Real Estate Sales Commission Lien Act allows that a broker has put a lien upon the owner's net proceeds of the sale of the commercial real estate for the commission earned by the broker under the brokerage agreement. The lien upon the owner's net proceed is a lien upon personal property, which attaches to the owner's net proceeds and does not attach to any interest in the real property. The lien cannot be waived before the commission is earned. So very interesting, but this is a way that a lot of real estate agents and brokerages make sure they get paid. They put a lien against the net proceeds. Now, it doesn't affect the property. It's not a lien on the property, but it's a lien on the net proceeds. So they really can't scooch around yet. And this is something you see a lot. They're pretty scary about that. So I think we're going to have to TBD till next week because my goodness, I think we want to finish this off and make sure, and most of this stuff is pretty similar. What I will tell you is that this gets very confusing for people. This section 21 here, neither seller nor broker has used the services of or owes compensation to a real estate broker other than. So if a third party is trying to sneak in and get paid because they've referred a buyer who has an agent or something like that, no can doer, right? This is between who? The seller's broker, who that is, the licensee, the company, right? And the address and email, who is either a single agent, a transaction broker, or has no brokerage relationship. What are we? Transaction brokerage. And you're going to be compensated by who? The seller or buyer. I have seen both, right? It depends on how this deal is going down. And it's going to be pursuant to what? Both parties, a listing agreement or other. Maybe it's a commission agreement, right? I've seen oftentimes we use a commission agreement to get one party to pay. And then the buyer's broker has all their information that they list. And again, what is their brokerage relationship and who are they being paid for by? And was it both parties or was it from an MLS offer of compensation? Oftentimes commercial, it is not. Maybe you found it on LoopNet. That's not an MLS offer of compensation. In that case, you better get a commission agreement. You better get it in writing. If you have a deal that you have the customer for, you found it on LoopNet, and you ask them, hey, are you paying commission? Yeah, we'll pay you 3%, let's say. Fabulous. You don't do a commission agreement. You submit the offer. They make you sign things that allow yourself never to contact your buyers. They can actually steal your customers from you. Don't sign those. And NDAs, you got to be very careful about that. You better have one. Also, you submit an offer, you didn't get in writing that they're going to pay you commission. Good luck trying to get that commission. Because they're going to say, well, where do we have in writing our commission agreement? totally slimy happens all the time. Everybody who knows Raj, ask Raj how many times he's constantly trying to fight to keep commission. People trying to cut him out all the time. It's a mess. It's like a very slimy thing.
A lot of times the listing will let people say that they're not paying.
Yeah, sometimes I will say that they're not paying. They'll tell you verbally that they are, right? And then you bring your customers forth and then they say, well, I don't have anything in writing. And it says right here that we're not going to pay this. Yeah, all sorts of sliminess. So never, never, ever, never, ever give any customers any offer until you have a signed commission agreement, right? Something that says, and it has to be the party that actually supposed to be paying you. I say that, it seems funny. It's not. If someone says we have a listing, they don't have a listing, go to the seller of the property. Because if you go to them because you're assuming you're going to follow code of ethics, first of all, they're probably not even realtors. They're not even participants in the code of ethics. Number one, doesn't mean we're not following code of ethics. But if they don't have an exclusive listing, if they have an open listing, that's very oftentimes the case in a commercial, which means that they'll pay you if you bring the customer. Yeah. So they don't even have a listing agreement. And so why would you want to sign a commission agreement that they're going to pay you commission? I would want it from the person who's paying the commission, the seller, right? So these are things you got to think through. It's not like general real estate. Unless it's in the MLS and it's an offer of compensation, you have something you can fight for. It's something that you could go after procuring cause. But if not, and 9 out of 10 of these are not in the MLS. You got to be aware of that. Okay, do I have any questions from anybody?
No preguntas de eso.
No preguntas hoy. Okay, qué bueno. Entonces, so we will continue next week with our commercial listing. If we have anything to kind of finish up on the contract, we will, but we're going to do a commercial listing agreement next week and hope that we get some fun stuff. Thanks for coming.